All right. So, good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us today to talk about selective admissions and educational inequity. Sorry about the first few minutes having a little bit of technical issues, but again, thank you for joining. I am joined by Louisa Hanson today, and I will introduce a couple of another guest that will feature today. But first, let me give a bit of an introduction. My name is Tiffany Brown, and I'm the founder and CEO of Gillis Education. And Gillis Education is a boutique firm that provides private tutoring, special education advocacy, and other services and products for students and their families. We also have an education law and policy arm um, and consulting arm where we monitor ongoing trends, grapple with legal developments and policy issues in the education world that impact students and families. So we really seek to analyze these issues and advocate on behalf of students and their families at a local level as well as a federal level. And so today's presentation, we will focus on the practice of selective admissions and how school systems fuel and facilitate educational inequity by having special selective schools like magnet schools, public charter schools that allow certain students in and keep other students out. Now, of course, there are benefits to having selective admission schools, but we are in this presentation going to focus on the not so great things, the cons of selective admissions. And we'll explore this topic by focusing on Philadelphia's public school system. And so, even though we're focusing on Philadelphia, this topic is certainly applicable to and worth discussing in context of other major cities, like where I'm sitting here in Washington, D.C. So I'm hoping that maybe we can do a part two and explore what's going on in DC as well. Um, so I do have the pleasure of featuring Louisa Hanson, who you see on the screen now. Hi, Louisa. Um, is your mic working?
Yeah, all good.
All right. So I have the pleasure of introducing Louisa, and she is Gillis Education's Educational Policy and Research Intern. And she'll be actually leading today's presentation. She has worked extremely hard over the last few months with me, learning about education policy, researching different topics, helping to put our Ed Insights together, helping with some research for position statements. And she's heavily researched the topic that we'll dive into today. And we realized while talking about this and researching it that there's just like this just scratches the surface. So hopefully there's more research to come, maybe a white paper of some sort. But we really realized, that this is an issue that is really worth spending some time understanding and trying to figure out. Louisa Hanson is a Philadelphia native and School District of Philadelphia graduate. She's currently working towards a Bachelor's of Arts with honors in sociology and political science at McGill University. She's particularly interested in the role of neighborhoods and urban geography in educational inequities, which is perfect for why she's saying today, and searching for policy solutions that address the intersection of geography, sociology, and education. So thanks so much, Louisa. I'm also going to introduce Jennifer, who you'll hear from later in the presentation. Hi, Jen.
Hi, good morning.
So Jennifer is a rising junior at Barnard College studying neuroscience and behavior with a minor in feminist and intersectional science and technology studies. Her family immigrated from Guinea to Connecticut in 2007. And during high school, she participated in her school's Equity Council, which featured students, parents, and educators that met at the Board of Education to address the inequities and injustice in Simsbury public school system. Jennifer graduated from Simsbury High School in 2020. And now at Barnard College, Jennifer continues to advocate for equity in education, among other areas. She has written an op ed about how the pandemic has further allowed politicians, private schools, and wealthy parents to attack public schools. She has also completed a project exploring how school choice, specifically in Connecticut, can prey upon already marginalized communities. And this fact about Jen, I love. She, once becoming a neuroscientist, she will do research on the neurological, psychological, and developmental effects of racism and trauma, which is amazing. And in addition to becoming a researcher, she hopes to become a nurse midwife, eventually teaching future generations of birth workers through a decolonial lens. Great. So needed. So thanks, Jen, for joining us. And can you pronounce your last name for us? I didn't want to butcher it.
Yeah, Jennifer Koita.
Thank you. So Jennifer Koita will also be joining in on the conversation later. So we are going to get started, and I'm going to pull up a few slides for us to begin. Okay, so before I hand it over to Louisa to lead the presentation discussion, I do want to provide more context about why Gillis Education is actually interested in this topic of selective admissions in public schools. So the quote that you see on the screen is from a lecture in 1869 by US Senator Charles Sumner. And it really sets the stage for what we'll be talking about today. So Sumner's philosophy back in the 1800s, his philosophy on abolition was built on dismantling the racial caste system. And the quote says, "The separation of children in the public schools of Boston on account of color or race is in the nature of caste, and on this account is a violation of equality. Caste makes distinctions where God has made none." And so this was, if you all have read the book Caste by Isabel Wilkerson, this is a quote that she actually includes in her book all about racial caste. And tying this to education, most of us have heard of and know about Brown v. Board of Education, which was the landmark Supreme case that held that school segregation on the basis of race is unconstitutional. But we know that if we look around, we haven't quite achieved the ideals that are articulated and outlined in the Brown v. Board opinion. So schools very much are still economically and racially segregated. And so, how did we get here? How did we get here with, Brown v. Board passing and, it's 2022? How are schools still so segregated? Well, we know that this country has a cycle of, inequality, a cycle of inequity. So, to begin, we know that this country has a history of disinvesting in minority communities, private actions as well as federally sanctioned actions. So private actions, may have included terrorizing a community, lynchings, burning houses, even individuals and homeowners associations using racial covenants in their contracts to segregate neighborhoods. But on the other hand, we also had um, federally sanctioned segregation. And specifically, I'm referring to redlining. So, in a Supreme Court case called Buchanan v. Worley, um, the court held that racial discrimination through residential zoning practices are unconstitutional. But in the 1900s, in the early half of the 1900s, the early part of the 20th century, the federal government engaged in housing redlining. And that's a practice that has conditioned access to federally backed home loans on the perceived economic health of a neighborhood and used demographic factors such as race in determining how economically healthy a neighborhood was. So, this practice of redlining had an effect on access to credit, and therefore, people and because where families live basically determines where their kids go to public schools. This meant that families who lived in certain areas, certain hazardous areas, were marked in red ink or redlined, and they were denied loans, and they were zoned and segregated to underperforming public schools. Even when the Federal Housing Act passed in 1968, which made the practice of redlining illegal, we are still feeling the effects of redlining and disinvestment in minority communities today. Educational opportunities still remains very, very limited for many because of the inextricable link between housing and education. And not to mention, local zoning, local boundaries, school district borders often resemble that 1930s era redlining. Um, so that is the food for thought and the introduction that I wanted to give before we dive into selective admissions and the process of selective admissions in public schools. And again, we'll use Philadelphia as a case study. And with that, I'm going to hand it over to Louisa.
Hello. Thank you so much for that incredible introduction, Tiffany. What I hope will be a theme throughout my presentation is that schools and education is inextricably linked with all these other societal issues. So thank you again, Tiffany, for providing that incredible graphic to address the ways in which education is intertwined with other inequalities in cities and across the country. So what I'm going to begin with is just some statistics about the school district so we kind of know what we're dealing with. So my first statistic is going to be 70% of Philadelphia public school students are Black and Hispanic. And if that number seems really high, it is because only 58% of Philadelphia children are Black or Hispanic. So right off the bat, we have a school district that's disproportionately Black and Hispanic, and you have white and Asian students who are concentrated in private schools and in magnet schools. So right off the bat, you have a disproportionately Black and Hispanic school district that is, let's see one sec. You have a disproportionately Black and Hispanic school district that is $57 million in the hole, according to the school district itself. The school district itself has declared that they have a budget shortfall of $57 million in just 1 year. So based on numbers alone, Philadelphia students who are disproportionately Black and Hispanic in public schools are being underfunded. And clearly there's a need for more funding from the state. But this picture of education in Philadelphia and in other urban centers, even in Pennsylvania, is far more complex than a simple lack of funding. Rather, the way that funding, as well as teacher skill and educational prestige, are distributed within the district exacerbates inequality. A few prominent selective admission schools within the district receive considerable capital, but neighborhood schools bear the brunt of this budget shortfall. So before I get more into magnet schools and selective admission schools, I'll just make some definitions really quickly. So selective admission schools are a popular remedy to the challenges of low quality urban public schools, but they can be confusing and they're very widely misperceived. Very plainly, selective admission schools reject the traditional model of location and neighborhood-based education in favor of different criteria and specific applications for admission. Selective admission schools can be public or private, and I'll define the distinctions on the next slide, but this presentation focuses on magnet schools, which are publicly funded and publicly operated. So a magnet school, just like the one that I went to, is a public school offering special instruction and programs not available elsewhere, designed to attract a more diverse student body from across a city in a school district. So ironically, magnet schools first came into being following Brown v. Board, as Tiffany mentioned, and the civil rights movement in the late 1960s and early 1970s as a tool to desegregate schools in large urban districts. So essentially, magnet schools were intended to attract students from across segregated neighborhoods by opening their enrollment citywide and providing an experience that would attract students and families from different neighborhoods. So essentially, they were meant to act as a tool of voluntary rather than forced desegregation by encouraging parents of all different races and backgrounds to send their children to these schools. So the Public School Review defines magnet schools based on three criteria, which would be a distinctive curriculum and/or instructional approach, a diverse student body representing various neighborhood attendance zones, and a school that represents diversity as an explicit purpose and mission. Proponents of magnet schools argue that school choice is beneficial for parents and increased funding allocated to magnet schools attracts a diverse student body. However, as this presentation strives to demonstrate, this diversity is often illusory and comes at the cost of educational and social experiences for Black and Brown students. So while I've already defined magnet schools, charter and private schools are the other type of selective admission schools. They're often mixed up with magnet schools and they pose their own issues, which I won't be able to get into in this presentation, but deserve mention nonetheless. Private schools are privately funded and managed, although they do often receive tax breaks from the state. They charge tuition and are not bound by the curricular and political constraints of the state. In between private and magnet schools, public charter schools are publicly funded but privately managed and often abide by a unique educational philosophy similar to magnet schools in order to attract students. However, magnet schools exist outside of zoned school boundaries. Whereas private schools are completely separate from local public school districts and charter schools are public schools with private oversight, magnet schools remain part of the public school system and operate under the same administration and school board. All right, so I'm sure selective admission has crossed many a news feed in the past year or so, especially during the pandemic. Magnet schools are often controversial, especially depending on the criteria they rely on for admission. Constitutionally, similar to affirmative action at the post-secondary level, magnet schools are permitted to consider race in admission as long as it is not a deciding factor. Many magnet schools also take into consideration students' economic background and previous education when evaluating potential and the ways in which test scores are impacted by students' backgrounds and systemic inequalities. However, the consideration of race and the ongoing movement away from test scores for admission has drawn controversy and lawsuits. Most prominently, a group of Asian American parents sued the New York City Board of Education following former Mayor Bill de Blasio's initiative to diversify New York's 8 specialized high schools, which are predominantly white and Asian and only 9% Black and Hispanic. In June of 2018, de Blasio and his school's chancellor, Richard Carranza, announced a plan to increase Black and Brown students' access to these schools by, among other initiatives, eliminating the standardized test that determines admittance. Asian American legal organization Pacific Legal Foundation sued, claiming that, and I quote, Mayor de Blasio has changed the program in a way that discriminates against Asians and makes the specialized schools, he hopes, more racially balanced, more similar to his preferred racial balance of students. So this lawsuit remains ongoing, and under new Mayor Eric Adams' administration, this process of diversifying these specialized admission schools has stalled. In San Francisco, a prominent magnet school and alma mater of Supreme Court Justice Stephen Breyer, Lowell High School, has eliminated its merit admission criteria entirely in 2021, instead instituting a lottery system that has greatly diversified its student population. At Lowell, the freshman class of 2021 to 2022 is the most diverse in decades, compared to a previous Black student population of only 2%. Alumni sued in November of 2021 in response to this policy change and a lack of communication they alleged regarding the change. And a judge sided with these alumni, forcing the school board to reevaluate their policy. Following this, in February of 2022, voters recalled 3 members of the school board in special elections, due largely to the backlash regarding Lowell admissions. For now, the random lottery stands, but the new school board is likely to reinstitute merit-based admissions. And finally, in my hometown of Philadelphia, the school district this past fall of 2021 changed its admissions policy for special schools, shifting from a system where principals had some say over those who made the cut at the 37 special admission schools to a computer-based lottery for all those with the test scores and grades to qualify for admission. For 5 top magnet schools in the district gave preference to students who met these academic standards as well as lived in certain zip codes typically underrepresented at such schools. While this policy certainly makes strides towards diversity, only 2% of Black and 3% of Latino 8th graders citywide met the bar for masterman entry, and only 8% of Black and Latino students citywide met Central's requirements. These two are the best college preparatory magnet schools in the district and are also predominantly white and Asian. However, promisingly, 62% of students who met admission criteria to enter the special admission lottery were Black and Latino this past year, compared to only 40% before the change. When taking into account that 58% of Philadelphia students are Black and Latino, and far more public school students are, the policy makes strides towards equalizing admission at these selective schools. However, in April of 2022, lawyers from America First Legal, an organization created by former aides to former President Donald Trump, sued the district, claiming that this new policy violated the Pennsylvania Constitution's Equal Protection Clause. This suit remains in the courts for now. So while policymakers are taking steps to diversify admission to magnet schools, these schools remain disproportionately white, Asian, and wealthy. And even when Black and Latino and lower income students are admitted, they face educational barriers and segregation within magnet schools. So in comparing magnet schools to neighborhood schools, while magnet schools are more racially balanced than their traditional neighborhood school counterparts, other imbalances do develop. Magnet schools are less likely to have the same socioeconomic status mix that regular public schools have. For instance, fewer magnet school students as a whole are eligible for free or reduced price lunch. Students in a magnet school are more likely to live in a two-parent household with employed parents with college or graduate degrees when compared to students who don't attend magnet schools. And interestingly, these findings apply to students regardless of their race. While students with a lower socioeconomic status may be underrepresented in magnet schools, a study in collaboration between the Citizens Commission on Civil Rights and Vanderbilt University shows that when lower socioeconomic status students do attend magnet schools, they achieve better academically than similar students who remain at regular public schools. Evidence from magnet schools in St. Louis suggests that lower income students in magnet schools are more likely to complete high school than their counterparts in non-magnet schools. Generally speaking, students attending magnet schools achieve greater academic success than students who attend traditional schools in the same school district. While this academic success at public magnet schools can benefit lower income families with less educational attainment, magnet schools do tend to serve more privileged students and function to keep middle-class families in the city school district by promising parents better schools for their children. High-achieving students and their parents, who tend to have greater amounts of social and economic capital, are concentrated in magnet schools, leaving neighborhood schools to languish. In Philadelphia, the majority of neighborhood schools are rated as low quality by the district itself. Given the racial and socioeconomic discrimination posed by this admission process to magnet schools, white and Asian students are concentrated in high-achieving schools, while Black and Latino students are largely relegated to neighborhood schools, which are considered low quality by the district itself. And among students with qualifying test scores, Philadelphia special admissions schools rejected higher percentages of certain groups of students. These groups included Latinos, Black students, boys, students receiving federal poverty assistance, and those receiving special education support. And among those who did not meet the test score criteria, acceptance rates at the special admission schools were higher among Asians and individuals not receiving federal poverty assistance. Now, in the words of journalist Nicole Hannah-Jones, in a post-racial era, we don't have to say it's about race or the color of the kids in the building. We can concentrate poverty in kids of color and then fail to provide the resources to support and sustain these schools. And then we can see a school full of Black kids and then say, oh, look at their test scores. It's all very tidy now, the whole system. Therefore, the inequities in admission to magnet schools take on tremendous impact, as those who fail to gain admission to magnet and other special admission schools are often relegated to underperforming and underfunded schools that are less likely to promote academic achievement or provide the resources and education necessary to attain post-secondary education and socioeconomic mobility, therefore reproducing the societal inequalities that created the system to begin with. So now to provide some statistics, here we have a Pew Research Trust analysis of the demographics of special admission high school students in Philadelphia compared to all students in the district. And as you can see, white and Asian students are overrepresented. You can see the dark blue line going over the light blue line. That demonstrates over or underrepresentation at magnet schools. So you can see that white and Asian students within the district are overrepresented at special admission high schools, as are those who do not receive governmental poverty assistance, nor receive special education support, nor receive English as a second language support. And now to address the previous educational experience of freshmen enrolling at magnet schools. This I found incredibly stunning, although not surprising. Of those who attended selective admission middle schools, 80% continued on to selective admission high schools. Of those who attended private middle schools, 80% went on to selective admission high schools. To contrast, only 25% of those who went to neighborhood middle schools went on to selective admission high schools. This demonstrates that magnet school inequities begin before high school and is a sobering reminder that educational advantages and disadvantages tend to build on each other over time, even in the educational course of just one student. And even within magnet schools, even if Black and Brown students manage to overcome these systemic hurdles and gain admission to selective admission secondary schools, obstacles remain for their academic and social success. At Lowell High School, the magnet school in San Francisco that I mentioned, in the fall of 2021, 42% of Black students received a D or an F, compared to only 5.3% of white students. As the president of the student body points out at Lowell, these grades demonstrate systemic issues in how the district prepares children of different racial backgrounds for a rigorous high school, and failures to make up for subpar primary education and provide sufficient academic supports for Black and Latino students. Nationwide, in the 7th grade, Hispanic and Black students were most likely to enroll in the standard math course, which at that point would be pre-algebra, and less likely than average to take one of the 3 advanced courses taken typically by white students. For example, white students took accelerated middle school math 20% more often than the average for their grade, while Black and Hispanic students took the course 30% and 17% less often than average, respectively. Nationwide, students have found that Black and Hispanic students lack access to advanced courses, especially in math and science. In part, this is because they cannot take prerequisite courses early enough in secondary school to qualify for college prep courses in high school. An analysis of federal civil rights data found that calculus is offered in only a third of US high schools with high concentrations of Black students, versus more than half of those with low Black student populations. Academic tracking then amplifies these inequalities at a secondary level. Many magnet schools are diverse at the aggregate school level, but are composed of segregated classrooms. Thus, the school as a whole is considered desegregated. Policymakers pat themselves on the back with no consideration for the harm exacted by segregated classrooms. Magnet schools tend to assign neighborhood school students to racially identifiable classrooms. Black and Latino students are more likely to have attended underperforming, segregated neighborhood primary schools, whereas white students tended to have gone to better primary schools and are thus more prepared and tracked into higher level classes. Furthermore, predominantly white teachers who need to recommend students in many cases advanced classes often perceive white students as more capable or more attentive than Black students based on their own internal biases. As legal scholar Kimberly West argues, academic tracking within magnet schools provides middle and upper class white parents who seek to minimize contact between their children and Black children with a means of maintaining a de facto separation even within integrated schools. Studies have demonstrated that the increased diversity at the school level leads to a higher use of tracking, where Black and Latino students tend to end up on the lowest track. Thus, in a painful contradiction, more diverse schools tend to be more intensely segregated at the classroom level, with white students having access to more resources, better teachers, and more college preparatory classes, and Black and Latino students suffering academic consequences, as well as the social and psychological consequences of being identified and tracked as less intelligent or less capable. Finally, magnet schools mete out discipline inequitably to sell themselves to white parents. Since magnet schools must attract their students, administrators and officials adopt practices to make their schools appeal to white students and parents, cracking down disproportionately on students of color to promote an image of their schools as in control of disciplinary problems in order to entice white parents to send their children to the Black neighborhoods where many magnet schools are located. This unfair and unequal discipline carries social and academic consequences for Black and Latino students who miss valuable learning time, have negative disciplinary marks on their files when they apply to college, and are consistently receiving the message that they are inferior, dangerous, and not as capable as their white classmates. While magnet schools are often touted as incredibly beneficial for Black and Latino students, and can certainly be a tremendous tool of social mobility, the inequities present within these schools can be immensely harmful to the social and academic lives of Black and Latino students. So now that we've addressed preliminarily the problems within magnet schools, what are the paths forward? So current popular ways to address these inequities include altering admissions criteria to take into account race and socioeconomic status, setting aside percentages of seats at at magnet schools for neighborhood school students, and lotteries like that seen at Lowell High School in San Francisco. While these admissions changes do tend to increase the percentage of lower income Black and Latino students at magnet schools, they fail to address the segregation present within magnet schools and don't address the plight of the vast majority of public school students who do not attend magnet schools. State Representative Donna Bullock of Pennsylvania, a parent of 2 students at Philadelphia magnet schools who's also Black and also my state representative, posits that the school district's admissions overhaul is a misguided, one-size-fits-all solution for a nuanced problem. She lauds the district's efforts to diversify top schools, but argues that their new computerized lottery is the wrong way to do it. Bullock instead argues, and I concur, that the district should address inequities beginning in pre-kindergarten education and improve public elementary schools. As another Philadelphia parent who wished to remain anonymous told the Inquirer about primary school inequities, it appears the district has conceded. We can't fix that in regards to elementary school inequities, so they're trying to jimmy the system at the top. If the school district looks more equitable on paper, that would make them look better, but I'm not sure we're going to get where they want to go with these changes. A key part of the issues affecting the school district of Philadelphia is a simple lack and misallocation of funding for schools. Neighborhood schools, as well as school districts at large, are funded by a set amount of dollars from the state, as decided by the Republican legislature, with the remaining shortfall made up by property taxes from the district. How this plays out in real life is that schools and districts serving impoverished areas that tend to be more Black and brown due to socioeconomic inequalities are underfunded, as properties worth less produce less in property taxes. A relatively straightforward policy fix for this issue would be eliminating property taxes from the school funding equation in favor of a formula that takes into account the increased cost of educating underprivileged children who may require more supports and may not speak English as a first language. So rather than rewarding the suburban school districts who have an easier time and require less money to educate their students, a more equitable formula would actually direct more money to the school districts serving primarily underprivileged children. While the state of Pennsylvania currently does fund suburban and wealthy school districts at a higher rate than impoverished city school districts, this must be turned on its head to erase educational funding disparities. In Philadelphia, each student receives about $13,000 a year in funding from the state, whereas in neighboring Lower Merion, just 15 minutes from my house in Fairmount, students receive about $22,000 a year in funding, just across the border of the county in this wealthier school district. And many school districts, when confronted with a colossal and complex issue encompassing housing, food, employment, and higher education issues, attempt to take an easier path towards token diversity on paper without addressing the very real consequences of their policies for the Black and brown students that attend magnet schools, not to mention the Black and brown students relegated to underfunded neighborhood schools. Now, education is so much more than what happens within the 4 walls of the school. And in order to truly equalize schools, given that education does reflect societal inequalities, these societal inequalities would need to be ameliorated. In an ideal world, magnet schools would be unnecessary, and all neighborhood schools would be able to educate students and set them on the path that they desire, be that college, trade school, or just life. However, in the interest of pragmatism and benefiting as many students as possible, I've gathered a preliminary list of reforms, building on the work of my friend Miriam, who I will introduce briefly in a second, and other Black students at Central, my high school, that could improve diversity and improve the experience and outcome for lower income Black students at magnet schools. So my preliminary list, I have a little more on the previous slide. So just preliminary research has shown that family outreach, inclusive enrollment practices, free and accessible transportation, culturally responsive curriculum, a more diverse teaching force, professional development and implicit bias training for staff, and restorative discipline could make great strides in equalizing the experience of magnet schools for everyone. Now, I am a firm believer in pragmatism and improving day-to-day lives for all for whom it is possible. Magnet schools are extremely imperfect, but so is urban education and education in general. I knew many students at my high school at Central whose parents did not graduate from high school, and their children now attend Ivy League universities after attending a magnet school. In a segregated and highly impoverished city such as Philadelphia, magnet schools do have the capacity to create incredible opportunities for underprivileged students, and this can't be ignored. However, it also cannot be ignored that magnet schools continue to reproduce educational and societal inequalities, and can harm students psychologically, even if they are able to attend elite universities and continue on to illustrious careers. At its core, education is meant to be a tool of social mobility and self improvement. There's no single correct answer to improving urban education, but I am lucky enough to have met the most incredible and thoughtful young people at my magnet high school, to whom I will turn over the floor now as we discuss their experiences with selective admission schools and policy paths forward. So I'm briefly going to introduce my friend, Miriam Sissoko. Miriam Sissoko is, wow, that is a lot, a rising junior at Barnard College, studying women, gender, and sexuality studies and anthropology with a concentration in feminist intersectional science and society studies. Their research interests include looking at the language used by media to describe Black girls and women in sports that intentionally marginalizes and over-polices their bodies. They are a proud resident of West Philadelphia, and during their time in the school district of Philadelphia, was a leading advocate, the writer of Central High School's Black Student Demands, and a co-founder of the Philadelphia Black Student Alliance, an alliance of Black students at magnet and public schools across Philadelphia to address Philadelphia's unique problems. Miriam has continued their advocacy at Barnard as one of the co-leads of a Students of Color boycott in their freshman year that aimed to address the ways that predominantly white institutions harm and use BIPOC, but specifically Black students, as a tool for white students to learn. During their sophomore year, they led multiple initiatives, including running a community closet that provided free clothing and personal care to low-income and first-generation students, as well as launching a chest binder drive to provide gender-affirming and life-saving care to non-binary and genderqueer students across all 4 of Columbia University's undergraduate college. And they are currently working on a Barnard policy initiative to implore Barnard to use gender-expansive language in reference to their current student body, which consists of non-binary and trans students as well as women. They currently serve on Barnard's student government as Vice President of Equity, and they hope to continue to center the needs and voices of marginalized students. They are on track to receive a PhD in ethnic and gender studies and anthropology in order to one day directly write the policy impacting the most marginalized and forgotten people. I am lucky enough to have met Miriam in our horrible sophomore year English class. And I am going to turn over the floor to them to read the introduction and the demands from Black students at Philadelphia's Central High School.
Yeah, can you hear me? Just want to make sure. So we just want to say thank you to Louisa for reaching out and letting us have this opportunity, especially highlighting the voices of Black students at Central High School. So these demands were written in May 2020 following a series of racist incidents and disappointing responses from our mostly white administration. They were led by a conglomerate of Black organizations at Central, but specifically by the African American Student Union. They kind of started as a cry out after George Floyd, and we kind of got together and just sort of recognized all of the problems and realized we needed to do something. We were tired of talking. So we organized a speak out attended by over 700 of Central's community, including students, alums, faculty, administration were there. And during the speak out, 10 Black students and alums shared their stories of sort of racist abuse and neglect by Central's administration. And each of these stories correlated with one of the 10 demands. I had the honor of co-organizing this event, also co-writing the demands, but specifically writing the foreword, which I'm about to read. And I can say that it's been exactly 2 years, Thursday, since this event happened. It's one of my proudest moments thus far in my life, but also since 2 years, 2 years since we graduated, because the event happened the day before our graduation. Over 80% of these demands have been met by Central's administration and by the School District of Philadelphia. Okay, so this is the forward. Like I said, one of my proudest moments of writing. Central High School functions off the myth of meritocracy, that every student who enters the red doors located on 1700 West Olney Avenue is granted the same opportunities, perceived the same way, and if a student fails, then it is their fault. This is simply not the case for many Black students who are admitted to Central. It is clear from the protest outside that we do not live in an equal nor equitable society. For this reason, it is impossible for meritocracy to exist. By operating as if it does, Central unwittingly erases the social disenfranchisement of Black and Brown students. It is time we understand that racism hides in the rear view, festering in every single one of us like a cancer, poisoning society until we can no longer breathe. Over the years, Central has taken a rather reactive approach to racist incidents that don't address the deeper wounds at hand. It is the equivalent of putting a band-aid over a bullet wound. With these 10 demands, we urge Central to live up to its missions, preparing students to be thoughtful leaders in a heterozygous world.
All right. Now I'm going to ask Miriam if you're interested, if you wanted to read the demands from the Black Youth Coalition. I highlighted the ones that were most relevant to the presentation because it was a very lengthy document. But if you wanted to just touch on these highlights, that would be awesome.
Yeah, of course. So a couple of demands were review disciplinary decisions made about Black students, drawing on a Black student advisory board that would meet monthly with faculty to discuss issues impacting Black students at school. I can say that has been met and is still active. Introduce academic support to level out elementary school inequities, summer bridge and mentorship. That also has been, that was one of the first demands to ever be put into place. And I still go back every year to do the summer bridge program. Hire a diversity and inclusion coordinator. She's there. Recruit Black and Brown students for advanced classes intentionally and specifically. And admit testing to create a holistic process that eliminates tracking preference. That has also been implemented. Restructure curriculum to include African American achievements and authors. That's frankly on a teacher by teacher basis. And refine school events to be more accessible to Black families. Address implicit bias among teachers and students, hire more Black teachers and restructure hiring committees, create a Black student recruitment team to reach out to predominantly Black middle schools and guide students through the application process, and recruit more Black orientation leaders. The second half of these demands are still something they're constantly being worked on, but it's getting better every single day. Like, that sounds so corny, but it is, despite the pushback that we are seeing right now.
All right. Thank you so much, Miriam. And I just wanted to highlight the voices of Black students at Central. And I want to really, if you take nothing away from this presentation, I've linked the demands and forward document. I want to really encourage everyone to read that. Again, I want to highlight the words of my Black classmates for whom intra-school segregation and magnet school inequities are a life experience and not a research project. And I want to draw on their passion and thoughtfulness as we begin to look into the future for ways to solve the educational inequities perpetuated by magnet schools. So with that, we've already introduced Jen, but we're going to just launch into a discussion. I think beginning with just if Miriam and Jen want to share a little bit about their experiences and how that's informed their activism today.
Oh, you can. Do you want to go ahead, or do you want me to go?
Oh, I just spoke, Jennifer. You can go.
All right. Could you repeat the question to make sure I have every piece of it?
Yeah, pretty much. It's just a really basic introductory question, especially for you, Jen, because your experience was different than Miriam's and mine. So just kind of asking like what your experience was with magnet and selective admission schools and how that's informed your activism with educational policy now.
Yeah, so I went to a public school. It was not in the city that I grew up in. It was in a neighboring town about 30 minutes away, and it was part of the CREC program. That's like the overall Connecticut Regional Educational Council. That's started as a grassroots, but then after a landmark case, I think in the 90s, it became partially state run as well. And under that, they have something called the Open Choice Program, which is a school choice program. And they have public schools and magnet schools, and like I believe even charter schools. But I personally was matched with a public school. And even though like it was a public school, like getting chosen or getting matched with a school, I believe kind of slightly fits into that selective admissions that you're just talking about. And so for me, a lot of my experience literally felt like being part of a desegregation project, because that was partially why the program started in the 60s. And so that's exactly what it felt like decades later. And for me, it was obviously like very upsetting, and it took me until middle school, until Black Lives Matter movement became more mainstream, and seeing how my reaction was very different to that of my classmates, as always being the only Black student in that class, in my classes, throughout my education. And it was a very isolating experience, not having people who could relate, or even people who even cared about like what was going on. And so that was just kind of, I guess, the start of my journey. And it was really into high school that I started being more of an active member in my community and actively trying to make the experience better for me and the other students part of the open choice program. And it overall, I look back on it, I was like, all right, that was definitely an experience. Wasn't horrible, but I can say it's something that if I had younger siblings, or if like later on when I have my own kids, I wouldn't say it's something that I think is worth it. I don't think the education, the resources I got are necessarily worth like feeling that isolated and literally going through like your administration, um, trying to appease white parents after their students were doing blackface and not caring about what the Black students and their families were feeling, even though we were the direct victims of those acts. And so, just to answer your question, because of all this experience, when I got to high school, no, sorry, not high school, when I got to college, I was like, I might be a teacher. And so I was like doing the education classes, and I had an amazing course last fall. And even though now I no longer want to teach elementary school, like educational equity is so important and it literally contributes to every aspect of your life. Because you spend 12 years in school. That's a lot. And that shapes like what opportunities you have, what you can do, how you feel about yourself, how you feel about your community. And so I think everyone should be an advocate for educational equity because it's something that affects literally every single person and every facet of our society. That was long-winded. I hope I answered the question.
No, that was perfect. Like I really like you really touched on pretty much everything in the presentation, which was incredible. And yeah, just for like other folks, like I do want to highlight Jen participated in a school choice program. She's from Hartford, Connecticut, and
Yes.
participated in a school choice program where she was, am I correct? She was bused to a neighboring white suburb and attended a public school. So just for a little bit more context. But yeah, Miriam, if you wanted to also answer that question, if you have any response to what Jen said also.
Yeah, everything that Jen said really resonated with me. I mean, we've had these conversations multiple times, just because our experiences have been so similar. I always say, especially when it comes to topics like this, that I was lucky, because by all chances and purposes, the school that me and Jen go to in a lot of predominantly white institutions kind of take us as Black students and they like put us on this pedestal as the example of like what like you should do. Like this is like not like this is not a structural problem. This is an individual problem. And this has really been shaped by my educational journey as having someone being lucky enough to be born to two parents who were educators. And I remember so distinctly at 8 years old, my dad saying, "You will never attend a public school in Philadelphia." And I mean, that was their choice. My parents didn't have a lot of money, but they sent me to Catholic school, in a private institution up until 5th grade, via scholarship. And then I attended a charter school, which I know Louisa didn't get too into, but they have their own issues, and they're kind of a hit or miss when it comes to Philadelphia. I was lucky enough to receive a hit, and my charter school is amazing, and that allowed me to go to Central, but the moment I got to Central, it just was like entering a jungle. When we first entered, Central was still, I had a 30-30-30 ratio, which was 30% Asian, 30% white, 30% Black. But even then, like if you looked at the Black student populace, only like 2 or 3 students came from like certain schools. Like my school, only 2 or 3 students got admitted, from my charter school, which was predominantly Black, as opposed to like you would see students from Masterman or Baldy or these other like specially select charter like schools, middle schools in Philadelphia, and they would be like 50 to 100 students deep, coming from these schools, and you could just see like the difference, not only with like the school divide, but the racial divide. And this was further highlighted. The most Black people I had were in my freshman year classes, because the moment teachers were like, "Oh, you're smart," we went on to advanced classes. Well, I went on to an advanced class, and they were just like, it was a color shift. It immediately went from, despite the school having an equal ratio of 30 of Black students and of race, these advanced classes predominantly had white or Asian students, and I was one of the few Black students. And this is where I met Louisa, because otherwise we would not have met, because our school was also self-segregated in that manner. And I can say that my experience within these advanced classes, specifically in IB, while I think it was one of the best educational experiences I could get, and I would not literally not be where I am right now without it, the harm that it did to me as a Black student to be in those spaces, and to not only be marginalized but tokenized, was really, yeah, it was really upsetting. And I don't think I really processed it until my senior year, despite being in these classes since 10th grade, where I think just like one afternoon, just one incident that got like happened in me and Louisa's philosophy class, where I was the only Black student, and I just like burst into tears. And I just kind of like had it all, like the emotional toll that it had, just kind of came flooding out. And the counseling services at Central, which were predominantly white, like the counselors themselves, just were not equipped to handle that level of racial trauma, which is why in one of the Black student demands, it's talking about having Black counselors, because that mental health aspect is so important, especially at PWIs. Um, yeah, and just like one more thing with selective admissions, it's it's really complicated, and I feel complicated about it, because the solution is always to get more Black students into these spaces, but then these spaces are never equipped to handle more Black students.
Yeah, thank you so much for that, Miriam. I want to provide like just a little bit of context. IB is International Baccalaureate. The International Baccalaureate program is a worldwide program meant to guide students through 11th and 12th grades with kind of a focus on more interdisciplinary learning and writing, as opposed to the AP Advanced Placement, which tends to be more focused on math and science. And more like multiple choice. So the International Baccalaureate program at Central was a college preparatory program that sent, I think, probably half of its graduates to the University of Pennsylvania, other like prestigious schools, other Ivy Leagues, University of North Carolina. I think 8 of the top 10 in our graduating class had been IB students. So the International Baccalaureate was a very rigorous academic program. I just lost my train of thought. I had something else I was going to say.
It was only 60 students out of the 2,000 students at Central.
Exactly. So if you're even discussing how magnet schools are a microcosm of the school district, then IB is an even more intense microcosm. Yeah. Oh my God, I had an idea, but then I forgot it. But yeah, Miriam, I'd love to know, like I literally just lost my train of thought. But I'd love to know what you would say, like going forward, like if it is, and Jen as well, like I would love to know if you believe that magnet schools are overall like a good thing that should be saved, or if they should be scrapped and we should start again.
Jen, you can totally go.
Sorry, that's like a really big question.
I was gonna have you go first, because I didn't go to a magnet school, so I don't really have any experience with it. Even though it was part of like the school options you could be, selected into, it's not one that I went to personally. But from your presentation, what I've heard from other people's experiences, I think it is a tough question, because for some, like we've talked about, it has been like a good thing for them in some aspects. So in terms of like having access to better education, better resources, and having overall a better future as a result of it, it has really helped a lot of people. But on the other hand, people have had to make really big sacrifices, and it actively disadvantages other students as well. And whether or not they should be completely eradicated or reform, I think I just don't feel like I don't know enough to say one or the other. But I hesitate to say that they should be completely eradicated, because I feel like something that would, if it were to happen in a magical world where like tomorrow all magnet schools are like shut down, let's just say if that's a reality of things, I think it would cause a lot of damage, and I think it's something that like other institutions, we should be thinking more about overall what schooling needs to look like, and what equitable schooling needs to look like. And if the result of going after that means that magnet schools just wean out of that, then absolutely. But those are my thoughts.
Yeah, I mean, it's funny because you're like, I've never went to a magnet school, but you really have touched upon every point. I grapple with this a lot, because I think it's one of those things where I have to take my individual experiences and put them on a back pedal, but also understanding that they are important. Because obviously our magnet school helped me so much. I loved Central. Like, even I have a lot of my problems with it. I really did love that school, and I really loved our program. However, they are inherently harmful, especially like in the context of Philadelphia. The only schools that get attention are the magnet schools, and even then, they have their own little hierarchy where it's only Central and Masterman who get the attention. And like the biggest example I can think of this is during our 11th and 12th grade. And this is funny because this was another magnet school. SLA, Science Leadership Academy, it's a magnet school, high school. It lost its building contract. And they moved them in with Ben Franklin, which is a public high school, a neighborhood school. And they quite literally separated the building in half. One side was SLA, one was Ben Franklin, and they were renovating the SLA side to be nicer. And during this renovation, they found that the school had asbestos, and all of the students lost their building. And when they were doing a student speak out, the school district decided to separate the SLA students from the Ben Franklin students, which was Ben Franklin was more predominantly Black. And they made the time for Ben Franklin students to come during working hours and made the time for SLA to come after working hours. Now, both schools were treated horribly because while this was happening, the school district was committing like $20 million to Central to build a new a new theater building, like completely for the arts, while they had multiple schools closing down, neighborhood schools closing down, and also like students completely displaced. So it's like it just completely creates this environment where it's like, well, you do have a public school option for Black and Brown students, but they're not getting into this environment, or when they are in this environment, they are completely subject to racially hostile environments, or environments that refuse to meet them where they're at, or even acknowledge the fact that K-8 education within Philadelphia is completely inequitable. So yeah, I don't know if they should be abolished, but they should definitely be phased out eventually.
Yeah, like what I would say, like again, like in an ideal world, like they wouldn't be necessary. But then again, like I was discussing, I think with Tiffany at one of the planning meetings, essentially it's like a game of Jenga. So magnet schools are part of that, and they can help, like in a pragmatic way, magnet schools can help a lot of people. In an ideal world, they wouldn't be necessary, but what do we address first? Like, is it worthwhile making magnet schools more accessible to more Black and Brown students? Like, does the harm, like the psychological harm of going to a magnet school, like outweigh like the harm of going to a neighborhood school? Like, and how does that get measured in different ways? Like, I think actually, Miriam, it was interesting that you touched on. I think you said like you wanted to put your individual experiences at the back seat, but I do think it's really interesting to touch on individual experiences. This is something that Miriam and I have discussed pretty extensively, but it is really important because if you look at the statistics again that I presented even today, magnet schools are objectively increasing the educational attainment of a lot of low-income students. But the statistics don't tell every story, and the statistics don't recognize the vast majority of folks. Like even this conversation, like there's an incredible amount of public school students in Philadelphia who are not able to like get the educational attainment that we have by virtue of going to a magnet school. So I do think that individual experiences are really important because they because again, like on the face, like our high school when Miriam and I entered was 30% white, 30% Black, 30% Asian, and 10% Hispanic and or biracial or multiracial. So on the face, like people, like they always touted it, the second most diverse school in the country, reflected almost exactly Philadelphia's demographics. And like at the aggregate level, there are a lot of great things to be said about Central. I had a great experience at Central, but then when you get down to parsing individual stories like Miriam's story, and then if you look at like again Jen's experience with school choice, and like obviously like Miriam and Jen are both incredibly accomplished people, like their schools like prepared them incredibly well for what they're doing now. But then if you look at the individual stories of harm, I think that's very important, and I think that it's not often taken into account in the very technocratic ways that school districts operate, partially by necessity. But I do think that it is important to counteract these like really wide sweeping narratives with individual stories.
Great. So thank you so much, Louisa, for leading this discussion. And Jen and Miriam, thank you guys. I really appreciated hearing your stories. I have like a page worth of notes from what you guys were saying. And I just wanted to highlight a few. And then guess give my 2 cents. I love that you guys touched on racial trauma and the token diversity issue that happens when you just try to fill seats and you try to fill certain schools with Black students. I think that needs to be talked about and explored more. So I do have some internal notes that we need to really dissect experiences of students of color. Um, and also this notion of where to start, right? We know that this uh, is really a nuanced problem. We hear the statistics, we hear potential solutions, and we don't know what problem to solve first, right? I do want to highlight the importance, though, because it is one of Gillis Education's pillars is early childhood education. And I think, Louisa, you might have mentioned um, that, and I love what you said about, education being so much more than what happens within the four walls of a school, and that you really also need to fix housing insecurities, and you need to fix just general overall poverty, and you need to make sure that green spaces and parks and recreation are available and accessible in all neighborhoods. And you also need to have grocery stores and all of these things that are linked to how well our students are living, and therefore how well they're actually performing in school and what they're getting out of their teachers when they go to school every day. If the housing and the health and the mental health, if all of that is not okay, then the students are going to suffer. So there's just so much to tackle, and again, this could be like a part two and a part three. But I did want to, close us out and just thank Miriam, thank Jen, thank Louisa for joining us. Louisa, did you have any other questions that you wanted to ask before we close out?
Well, I'm checking out the chat, and I would love to always like hear anyone's opinions, whether in the chat or in the panel. Like Anthony Brown has said, what's an immediate solution that can help current students while we can currently work to realize the long-term goal of making elementary and middle schools equitable? And I think that this shows, like, obviously this is exactly what I've been trying to touch on with both pragmatism and long-term working goals. And obviously this is a difficult question. I briefly touched on with, I think really what I would love to hear is, I think this is kind of what Miriam has been addressing with their demands. So I would love to hear from Miriam, and also I would love to hear from you, Jen, about your experiences and how this can be applied. Because admittedly, and obviously, I don't have any experience with the school choice program in Connecticut, but I would absolutely love to hear anything that you might have to say, especially since it's like New York, Philadelphia, DC are very prominent, and folks are not really addressing smaller cities across like the East Coast and across the country where this is just as much of an issue, but a little bit less prominent. That's all.
Yeah, I want to keep this brief because I really want Jen to speak because I think she's amazing. But the first thing that popped into my mind is follow the money. One of the first things that needs to happen is sort of addressing the budgetary problems when it comes to the distribution of money to middle schools, how that money is happening. And yes, that's something that is going to take a long time to do. But there is already a court case within the Pennsylvania Supreme Court that's addressing the fact that Pennsylvania has violated Philadelphia public student constitutional rights by withholding funding from them, because the fact that they don't have funding, teachers are underfunded, is a huge part of why all of this is happening. But even beyond the funding piece, sort of the second prong of this two-prong solution, would it really be to just listen to Black students, or just listen to students of color, but like obviously we're centering Black students in this from my perspective. They are a lot smarter than a lot of people give them credit for. They know what's happening, even if they don't have the language for it, and they know what they need. As written by the Black Student Demands, we wrote that ourselves at like 11 p.m. at night, and we knew exactly what to say, and like we knew exactly what the institutional problems are because we're subject to them in a way that our peers aren't, and in a way that administration and faculty, and also teachers just don't see or refuse to see. So like that is one of the things that we know what we need, and we just want you to listen to us, and we want you to use the power that you have, which some of our teachers did, to uplift our voices, and also actually enact the change that needs to be happen. One of the reasons the Black Student Demands were able to even be reached, and more Black students and students of color have entered Central, is because like our administrator, our principal, or President Timothy McKenna, who's just leaving, in the school, and the superintendent William Height read those demands and said, "We will do them," and they did. Maybe not in the ways that we wanted them to do it, but it has led to positive change for students.
That's a really amazing response, and I would honestly love to hear more about what you're all doing at Central. I would have loved to have done something like that in Simsbury, but I felt like, well, one of the solutions that I proposed is including the parents of open choice students into their school. When I think about my experience throughout Simsbury, from second grade to 12th grade, there were very few times where it felt like our parents were ever being included. But this person's parent was always there. Like they had their little PTA, they would be on the field trips, or they would come in, take photos for our yearbooks, and do things like that. And it felt like they were actively trying to include the Simsbury parents, and some of them made sure they were included, because they know their voice would be heard. But then our parents, they were not included. And one of the solutions to address that is to make PTA meetings or other kind of parent meetings accessible, or even the parent teacher conference meetings, have them be live stream, have a telephone option, because we live 30-40 minutes away. And when you're doing a meeting at 3 p.m., because they will usually do those meetings on half days, our parents are at work. They don't live 10 minutes down the street. They can't just come in, or they have other kids that they need to take care of, and they're not stay-at-home parents. They have other things they need to do, and it was just so inaccessible. And it felt like throughout our whole education, our parents were just not involved. And then I remember in 11th grade, 2 white teachers who really thought themselves to be very liberal and progressive, asked me why don't you think, the Black parents seem to be involved in their school, children's education? We don't really get calls from them, but then with the white parents, if something goes wrong or a grade they don't like, they're calling us. Why doesn't the same thing happen with your parents? And I was like, all right, interesting question. And it just reeked to me that they thought it was our parents and our fault that our parents were not as involved as the white parents. Because even they don't try to involve our parents. Even us as students being bussed in, we weren't really a part of the community. They did everything they could, whether through language, specifically calling out the Hartford students, the correct students, the open choice students, announcing it on when the buses were late during a snowstorm, making sure to really segregate us. And then they're shocked that our parents, they thought were not as involved when they weren't even given a chance to be involved. They weren't sending letters home in different languages to address any language differences. They weren't doing that. They weren't calling our parents. They weren't inviting them to things. They weren't providing transportation to make it accessible to come to our, violin concerts. They weren't doing anything. And then they have the audacity to ask me in 11th grade why they don't think, essentially saying that my parents don't care about me and my education. They've done nothing, prior to that. And I think another solution is speaking to open choice specifically, and the project that I did and what I got to learn about them is that they need to start being honest with parents. I interviewed, talked to some people, and something that I heard that was really disheartening is that very few people there are actually honest with the parents about what's going on in those schools. And I was told that they specifically like, leave more room for children in like second, third, and fourth grade to bring them into the program because it's easier for them to fit in. And that was disgusting to hear because that's predatory to me. That they said they didn't want the older kids because it's hard for them to adjust. And the schools that will be accepting them don't really want the older kids because they're more trouble. But with the younger kids, it's easier for them to fit in. And so they know what environment they're bringing these kids into and the damage it's doing, but they just pretend they don't see it, or they don't want to actually address it. So I think they need to actually be honest with the parents about what is going on, take them on trips to the school, let them actually see and let them speak to the students already in the program. So they actually are knowing what environment they're bringing their kids into, because some would say that it's not worth it. And while this may not be like a super immediate solution, but I think it's absolutely necessary that the public schools in Hartford are actually receiving funding. I remember when I started school in Simsbury, I still had friends who went to West Middle School, which was the closest school to me. Like I would literally walk to school when I was in first and second and kindergarten. And so when I got there, a year later, my friends at that school, they're telling me that their school is shut down, like randomly in the middle of like the fall/winter period. The school is shut down and the state is scrambling to put them into other schools. But meanwhile, they're giving more funding, not enough funding, but some funding to the CREC program and open choice without giving that money to the public schools. So they're taking us out of there because they don't actually want to address any of the issues within the public schools. And so they're giving us to these other counties, other like mostly suburban areas, for them to educate us because they have more funding, and they give them extra funding as well for like our transportation. But then they don't want to invest that into the actual city schools. So long-winded, I could keep going on, but those are just like three that I think are absolutely necessary and should be done like right away.
Thank you for that. One thing that I wanted to highlight that really, I want to pass it off to Marion because I know that demand, especially about the accessibility of, I'm forgetting the phrasing, the accessibility of like parent initiatives for Black parents. But one thing that I really did want to highlight, because it reminded me of something that Miriam, I think it was Mr. P's class, we did a critical reading of Brown v. Board, which I had never done before in 11th grade. And I remember having always been taught it at like white liberal schools, like taught that it's a great thing. Obviously, desegregation is a good thing, but Brown v. Board itself was never critically analyzed. It was like, oh, like that's the ruling that desegregated schools. Awesome, great. But then we did a critical reading of it, and it's really like, it reminds me exactly of what you were discussing, Jen. It's pretty much forcing, like assuming that Black students are benefited just by being around white students. Like the value of integration being seen as Black students are like lucky to be around white students and are benefiting from integration because they are around white students. And then being put into these molds created for white students, Black teachers fired en masse because they were not seen as fit to teach white students. So in integrated classrooms, Black teachers were not supposed to be teaching white students. So basically, like Black students were kind of forced into this mold created for white students with the assumption that just their presence was going to benefit white students, and them being there was going to be better for Black students just by being in the presence of white students. So your story really resonated, I think, with that critical reading of Brown v. Board that we did in 11th grade. And I just wanted to touch on that because it was like bells going off in my head the entire time. But Miriam, I want to pass it over to you.
I have a couple things. One, just to respond to Louisa. I remember when we read that and just going like, huh, to the other like 4 Black students in our class. That's us. Just to like what Jen was saying about parents, it's so upsetting. It just reminded me one of the most powerful speeches during the protest that we had throughout the summer of 2020 with the Black Student Alliance. This was like right before it was formed. It's like the kind of like kernels of it when the schools were just getting together. A parent, she gave this really emotional speech where she started crying and everyone was crying. And she's just like, I want to be involved. And she basically started off saying, I'm sorry. I'm not trying to cry, but like, she like apologizes to her children and to other Black students because she's like, I wanted to be involved and I couldn't. Which is, I think when we're talking about educational equity, we don't really talk about that toll that it has on parents, especially Black parents who all they want to do is protect their children and give them the best educational opportunities possible. So yeah, like when Jen was speaking, I was immediately like drawn back to that. Even thinking of the speech, like I wish it's recorded, it's somewhere. just like overflow of emotion, because this is an emotional topic, even though when we talk about it, we're supposed to sort of like say it with a straight face, but like these were our experiences and they were incredibly harmful, not only to us, but also to our parents who can see this harm. They see the toll that this takes on their children. And because they don't have the opportunity to sort of get involved in the way that they would like, um, it's hard for them. And like, I really want to emphasize it on that, because parent involvement is so important and so crucial to educational equity, and proper education of any child.
Wow, very, very moving. I am so appreciative of again of you guys sharing your stories. And I again have so many notes to follow up on. I know that we can talk about this probably for a couple of hours. I've been on calls with both Jen and Miriam and Louisa, and we've gone on and talked about this because this is very important topic. And as Miriam said, it's an emotional topic, and it's a serious topic that we do need to take to heart. And part of one of Louisa's culminating um, assignments is going to be to really take this conversation and really outline almost like a set of demands, almost like Miriam's work a few years ago, a set of demands for school districts and school systems to think about and to really implement. And maybe we can work towards some immediate solutions, looking toward a long term um, fix, because this is a nuanced issue, as we mentioned. It has to be interdisciplinary. It has to be multifaceted. There's a lot to fix because of systemic racism. You're not going to fix it overnight, but we need willing partners. And we do need to listen to our students. We need to listen to our parents. And we really just need to open our eyes to the inequities. They're there, you can see them. And willing participants can fix it if we really push them. So I once again really, really appreciate your attending today, and I think that this was an awesome conversation. Louisa, again, thank you so much for your work on this. This was amazing. And please follow us on gilliseducation.org. We have a Twitter and an Instagram that you can catch our work. You can see what we're planning, what position statements we're writing, what letters we're sending to state legislatures and Congress. And you can sign up for our Ed Insights, which is a publication where we try to take what's going on in education policy, news and legal news, and we want to actually provide the insight as to why it's important and how it's impacting our students and our families that we work with. So, again, thank you so much. And we're signing off.